Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we are going to be tackling a pretty hot topic,
Oh, yeah.
the California housing crisis, and this pretty groundbreaking new law that's been making headlines. It's a big one, folks. We've got a ton of research ready to go, and joining me today is someone
I'm happy
with
to
an expertise on this.
and dive in.
So, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Glad to be here.
So let's start with like a really big picture here. Give us a sense of just how bad this housing crisis is in California. I mean, we hear about it all the time, but like, what are we actually talking about here?
So imagine this. California needs to build like a new city the size of San Diego just to keep up with the demand for housing.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay.
By 2030, we're looking at a need for an estimated 2.5 million new homes.
2.5 million.
That's a huge number.
That's wild.
Yeah, and there are a lot of things feeding into this. You got population growth, of course, but then you've also got job opportunities that are drawing people in. And then on top of that, you've got this history of zoning policies that have really just restricted the housing supply.
Okay, so 2.5 million homes. I mean, that definitely puts things in perspective, and I guess it explains why we keep hearing stories about folks paying, crazy high rents just for these tiny apartments or, even worse, getting priced out of the neighborhoods where they've lived, their whole lives.
You're exactly right. That lack of supply, it's driven up prices
Yeah.
to the point where California is facing like a full-blown affordability crisis.
Yeah, it's a tough situation for a lot of people. So then this new law comes along, and it seems like it's trying to tackle this crisis head on, but I gotta say it's causing quite a stir. What's the logic behind taking such a, dramatic approach?
Well, this law is not some random thing that just popped up out of nowhere.
Right.
It's actually a response to, decades of these housing challenges that have just been getting worse and worse. Lawmakers finally decided that the old ways just weren't cutting it anymore.
Yeah. Makes sense.
So this new law, it's trying to tackle four main issues.
Okay, let them on us.
First, this severe housing shortage that we just talked about. Then you've got the affordability crisis. Then you've got this inefficient land use. And then on top of that, you've got the state's very ambitious environmental goals.
Okay, a lot to unpack there. So you mentioned restrictive zoning laws. Can you maybe break down how those have played a role in all of this?
Sure. So for decades, a lot of California cities have favored single-family zoning,
Okay.
which means they basically reserve huge chunks of land only for detached homes. Now, while that might create, a certain look and feel, it also really limits how many homes you can actually build in a given area. And it makes it super hard to build more of those like affordable multifamily housing options like apartments and condos.
It's kind of like having, you've got a huge banquet hall, but you're only setting the table for like a tiny dinner party. You've got all this space, but then you're putting limits on who can actually come and sit down and enjoy the meal.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that brings us right to the affordability crisis. Multifamily housing tends to be way more affordable than single-family homes,
Right.
simply because you're sharing the land and the building costs. So by encouraging more apartments and condos, this law is aiming to give more people a chance to find a place they can actually afford, not just those who can shell out for a big detached house.
Right.
Makes sense, right?
Yeah, totally. I mean, California's always had a reputation for being pricey, but what's changed? I mean, why is this such a crisis point now?
Well, California has always had its share of housing challenges, for sure.
Yeah.
But in recent years, things have gotten really out of hand. The gap between what people earn and what it costs to live here has just exploded.
Oh.
And that's pushing essential workers, families, young people. It's pushing everybody to the brink. This law recognizes that being able to afford a place to live, it's not just about, personal finances. It's really about creating a healthy society.
Yeah, you can't exactly have a thriving economy if folks can't afford to live anywhere near where the jobs are.
Exactly.
You mentioned inefficient land use as another factor behind this law.
Right.
Can you give us some more details on that?
Picture this. You've got a bustling downtown area, lots of businesses, cultural attractions, public transit, the whole works.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
But then surrounding that downtown, you've got miles and miles of sprawling single-family homes. That's a recipe for traffic jams, long commutes, and it's not great for the environment either. So this law is encouraging denser housing development, closer to where people work and where the transit hubs are. The idea is to make it easier for folks to get around without having to rely so much on cars.
So it's not about like cramming more people into smaller spaces. It's more about using the land we have in a smarter way.
Exactly. It's about creating those walkable communities that are good for the economy and the planet.
Okay, I like it. And how does this all tie into California's environmental goals?
Well, denser housing means less sprawl, which is great for protecting natural habitats. And when people have shorter commutes, that means fewer cars on the road, and that means less pollution. And when you have denser communities, you can often have better public transit options.
Makes sense.
So yeah, this law, it really does align with California's goals to fight climate change by making it easier for people to live in a way that's more sustainable.
Okay, so we've got this like four-pronged attack on California's housing woes. But let's get down to brass tacks. What exactly does this law actually do?
Well, there are a few key parts of this law that are really shaking things up.
Okay, already.
The most controversial one is probably this thing called the zoning override.
Zoning override. All right.
So basically, it lets developers bypass those local zoning rules and build multifamily housing on land that used to be reserved for single-family homes, but they have to meet certain state requirements.
I can see why that's controversial. It sounds like a pretty direct challenge to local control. What else does it do?
It also tries to speed up the whole approval process. So for projects that meet certain qualifications, they get on this like express lane and they can cut through a lot of the red tape that usually slows things down.
Makes sense. So it's not just about allowing more housing, it's also about getting it built faster.
That's right.
But what about affordability? Is there anything in this law that makes sure that these new developments aren't just going to be, you know, luxury condos that only rich people can afford?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The law has built-in affordability requirements. So a certain percentage of those new units have to be set aside as affordable housing
Okay, good.
for people with low and moderate incomes. And that's a really important part of this whole thing because it ensures that the benefits of all this new housing it actually reaches a wider range of people.
Yeah, that's crucial. And what about those concerns we hear about, changing the character of neighborhoods or maybe even pushing out people who already live there? Does the law address those issues at all?
It definitely tries to.
Okay, good.
There are provisions in the law that aim to protect existing residents and make sure that new development happens in a fair way.
Okay.
For example, it says you can't demolish rent-controlled housing just to build something new, and it encourages community involvement in the planning process.
Right. So that way people can actually have a say.
Exactly. It's all about trying to find that balance between the need for more housing and the desire to preserve what people love about their communities.
Yeah, that's a tough balance to strike. So we've got a lot of big ideas at play
We
here.
do.
This law is definitely shaking things up. It's making us think about, who gets to decide what gets built where and for whom.
That's right.
It's about balancing individual property rights with the needs of the community. It's about local control versus this big statewide crisis. So much to unpack.
Absolutely.
But I think it's time to dive into the debate itself. What are the main arguments for and against this bold new approach to tackling the housing problem?
Well, the folks who support this law, they see it as a long overdue solution. They see it's the only way to bring down those sky-high prices and make housing affordable for everyone, not just the wealthy few.
So it's about tackling that root problem, the supply and demand imbalance.
Exactly. And they also say that this law will help to address the NIMBY problem, that not in my backyard attitude that often blocks new housing, even when it's desperately needed.
Yeah, it's like some folks are all for more housing just as long as it's not built anywhere near them.
Right. And from an economic standpoint, the supporters argue that affordable housing, it's essential for a strong economy. If people can afford to live closer to their jobs, it cuts down on commute times, people are more productive, and businesses can attract and keep workers.
Yeah, I can see how that would create like a ripple effect. More affordable housing leads to a stronger workforce, which leads to economic growth.
Exactly.
But of course, not everyone is thrilled with this law. What are some of the concerns that the critics are raising?
Well, one of the biggest concerns is that it takes away power from local communities.
Hmm.
Critics see this as a power grab by the state.
Right, so it's that classic battle between state power and local control.
Right. And they also worry about what all this new development will do to the character of existing neighborhoods. They're concerned about losing green spaces, more traffic congestion, and maybe even just a sense that their neighborhoods are becoming less unique and more generic.
So it's about preserving the things that make communities special, that sense of place and belonging.
Exactly. And then there are the practical concerns about structure. Can our schools, our roads, our public services even handle all these new residents?
Yeah, that's a legitimate concern.
It is. It's something that needs careful planning.
Okay, so we've got a lot of passionate arguments on both sides. This law is definitely a hot topic. It's forcing us to have some really tough conversations about, what kind of future we want for California.
It is.
It's not an easy conversation to have. But hey, that's why we're here on the deep dive, to dig into these complex issues and try to make sense of it all.
That's right.
Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty. Who stands to win and who might lose out in this whole housing shakeup?
Well, that's a great question. Let's start with homeowners.
Okay, let's talk homeowners.
In some neighborhoods, they might actually see their property values go up
Okay.
because their neighborhoods are becoming more desirable due to all this new development.
Okay, so more people wanting to live in an area could push up prices, supply and demand, right. But I'm guessing it's not all sunshine and roses for homeowners.
Right.
Right.
Some homeowners might have to deal with downsides too, like construction noise,
Yeah.
traffic disruptions. Some might even feel like they're being priced out of their own neighborhoods as property values and taxes go up.
Right. So it's a double-edged sword for them.
It is.
What about investors? Where do they fit into all of this?
Well, investors, especially those who are interested in multifamily housing, they're seeing a lot of potential here.
Yeah, I can see that.
With those zoning restrictions relaxed, they can pursue projects in high-demand areas that they couldn't even touch before.
Okay.
But it's not a free-for-all.
Yeah.
I still have to play by the state's rules,
Yeah.
meet those affordability requirements.
Right, and I'm sure they're facing some pushback from certain community groups, too.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so it's not just a blank check for developers. What about developers themselves? Are they all celebrating this new law?
Some are, for sure. It gives them more flexibility and a chance to make more money.
Right.
But there are also challenges. They still have to meet those affordability requirements, deal with potential lawsuits from cities that are resisting the law, and they have to manage those community relations.
Yeah, it sounds like they need to be more than just builders these days. They need to be negotiators, community liaisons, strategic thinkers.
Absolutely.
Finally, let's talk about renters. I mean, they're often the ones who are hit the hardest by this housing crisis.
Yeah.
Does this law offer them any hope?
It could. The idea is that with more housing available, it should help to bring rents down,
Mm-hmm.
especially those really expensive cities. So yeah, there's definitely potential for renters to see some relief.
Okay, so a glimmer of hope, but no guarantees. It sounds like this law has a lot of potential, but there's still a lot of uncertainty. And the stakes are really high.
That's right.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground here today. We've talked about the dire situation facing so many Californians, the reasons behind this bold new law, the heated debate that it sparked, and who might come out ahead and who might get left behind in this whole housing shade-up. But as we've heard, this is really just the beginning of the story.
It is.
So in part 2, we're going to roll up our sleeves and dive into some real-world examples of how this law is actually playing out on the ground.
I'm excited for that.
Yeah, me too. We'll look at what's working, what's not, and how different communities are responding to this major shift in housing policy.
It's going to be fascinating.
It is. So stay tuned, folks. All right, everyone, welcome back to the deep dive. In part 1, we really laid the groundwork. We talked about the why behind this big new housing law in California.
Right.
But now it's time to get into the nitty-gritty. Let's see how this thing is actually playing out in the real world. Are we seeing, construction crews everywhere? Are those quiet single-family home neighborhoods suddenly like sprouting apartment buildings left and right?
Well, it's still early days,
Mm-hmm.
but we are definitely starting to see the impact of this law.
Okay, good. I'm eager to hear about it.
And, it's one thing to talk about policy, but seeing it translate into actual buildings, that's where it gets really interesting.
Totally. We've talked theory, we've talked arguments, but what's happening on the ground?
Exactly. So let's start with a place like Berkeley, known for its progressive politics,
Right, Berkeley, yeah.
but also kind of ironically for having some of the strictest zoning rules in the whole state.
Okay, interesting.
Before this law, trying to build anything other than a single-family home in a lot of Berkeley was practically impossible.
So Berkeley's been a tough nut to crack when it comes to new housing. What's changed since this law took effect?
Well, let's just say developers are pretty excited. We're seeing a surge in applications for multifamily housing projects,
Oh, wow.
especially in areas near transit and, commercial districts. Those areas are looking a lot more appealing now that developers have a way around those zoning restrictions.
Okay, so has the floodgates open? Are those projects actually getting approved, or are they hitting roadblocks?
It's kind of a mixed bag.
Okay.
Some projects are sailing through the approval process, because of those fast-track procedures we talked about.
Right.
It's like they've got a VIP pass to skip the line.
I like it.
But other projects are facing pushback, sometimes really strong pushback from residents who are not too happy about the idea of more development.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's that classic tension between needing more housing and wanting to protect what you already have.
Exactly. Change is hard, especially when it comes to something as personal as your neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
People worry about traffic, parking, property values. Sometimes they just feel like their neighborhood is losing its character.
Right. It's like someone decided to widen your quiet street and suddenly everybody's got road rage. But I gotta believe that there are some projects out there that have figured out how to do this right. How to build more housing without causing a total neighborhood meltdown.
You're right, there are. There's this one project in San Jose that comes to mind. The developer really went above and beyond to get the community involved.
Okay, good.
They designed this multifamily housing complex that really blends into the existing neighborhood.
Oh, wow.
They used design elements that fit the local style. They included a public park. And they even figured out some creative ways to address those traffic concerns.
So they didn't just plop down a generic apartment building and say, too bad. They actually listened to what people wanted.
Exactly. And it worked. The project got a lot of support from the community, and now it's under construction. It just shows what can happen when people work together.
That's awesome. So it is possible to build more housing without ruining the character of a neighborhood?
It is.
It sounds like San Jose is doing a pretty good job with this new law. Are there other cities that are really taking this law and running with it, using it as a way to build better, more inclusive communities?
Yes. Sacramento's another good example. They've been super proactive about this.
Okay. Tell me more.
They're working with developers, community groups, residents, you name it. They're trying to find the best spots for multifamily housing and streamline the approval process.
Makes sense.
And they're really prioritizing projects that include a lot of affordable units. So they're making sure that everyone benefits.
So they're not just saying, okay, we got to build more. They're saying we got to build smarter and we got to make sure that everyone has a place at the table.
That's right. It's a really holistic approach.
It sounds like they're turning this law into a real opportunity, not just some, burden.
Yeah, exactly. But, not every city is on board with this whole thing. Are there places that are pushing back against this new state mandate?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask.
Yeah, fortunately, some cities are. Some are even trying to fight it in court. They say it takes away their local control and sets a bad precedent. And then others are just dragging their feet, hoping to slow things down and maybe even discourage developers.
Wow, so it's not all sunshine and roses out there.
No, it's definitely a clash of values and priorities.
Mm-hmm.
Some communities see this as a necessary change. Others are really worried about what it means for their future.
It's such a complicated issue. It touches on so many things, where we live, how we live, who gets to decide what gets built. But let's get back to the people who are most affected by this.
Right.
Are we seeing any real changes in the lives of homeowners, renters, developers?
Yeah, we are starting to see some trends, but it's important to remember it's still pretty early. Things take time to play out.
Of course, of course.
So let's start with homeowners. In some areas where they're building more multifamily housing, we're seeing property values increase.
Okay, so that whole supply and demand thing is kicking in. More people want to live in those areas, so prices go up. That's good news for some homeowners, I guess.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there are downsides too, right?
Definitely. Some homeowners are dealing with construction noise, traffic, headaches, changes to the look and feel of their neighborhood.
Yeah.
And for some, those higher property values also mean higher property taxes.
Right, and that can be a real burden, especially for people on fixed incomes.
Absolutely. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag for homeowners.
A double-edged sword for sure. What about renters, though? Are they seeing any relief? Are rents actually starting to go down?
There are some signs of that happening, yeah.
Okay, good.
In areas with new multifamily housing, we are seeing rents stabilize and even dip a little.
Okay, so maybe those theoretical benefits we talked about are starting to become reality?
Maybe.
Hmm.
But it's way too early to celebrate.
Right.
It's going to take years to really see the full impact of this law.
Of course.
And there's so many other things that affect the housing market.
Right, so we're cautiously optimistic, keeping an eye on those trends.
Exactly.
And finally, what about developers? How are they navigating this whole new world?
Well, the smart ones are realizing that they got to be more than just builders now. They have to be partners with the community.
Right.
They got to be strategic and they got to know how to negotiate. Some of them are focusing on projects that have a lot of affordable units.
Okay.
They're taking advantage of the incentives offered by the state. And they're realizing that there's a huge demand for housing that's actually affordable to regular people.
They're realizing that appealing to a wider market can be good for business.
Exactly. They're also working more closely with community groups to address concerns, incorporate local design elements, and make sure that new developments fit into the existing neighborhood. It's a much more collaborative approach.
So it's not just about making a quick buck, it's about building something that benefits everyone.
That's right.
Well, it sounds like we're starting to see some real changes happening out there, both good and bad. It's a complex picture for sure, with lots of moving parts and a lot of strong feelings on all sides.
Absolutely.
But this is really just one chapter in a much bigger story, right?
It is. It's the story of how we create a future where everyone has access to housing that's safe, affordable, and decent. A future where our communities are inclusive, vibrant, and sustainable.
That's a great way to put it. So we've seen how this law is playing out in the present, but what about the future? What are the long-term implications of this law for California and for the rest of the country?
Those are the million-dollar questions.
It are, and that's exactly what we're going to tackle in part 3 of this deep dive.
Can't wait.
Me too. We'll look at the bigger picture, the lessons we can learn, and how we can create a better housing future for everyone.
It's going to be a great discussion.
It is. So stay tuned, folks. Welcome back to the deep dive. We spent the last 2 parts really getting into the weeds of this new California housing law.
We have...
You know, the goals, the controversies, the impact it's having. But now I want to zoom out a bit.
Okay.
What does this all mean in the long run? Not just for California, but for the whole country. It's almost like California is this big experiment and everyone else is watching to see how it turns out.
That's a great way to put it. This law has definitely caught the eye of people all over the country. You know, policymakers, housing advocates, regular folks,
Right.
especially in places that are struggling with affordability. They want to see if California's approach, this bold approach, if it can offer any lessons.
So California's leading the charge here.
In a way, yeah.
What are some of the key things that other states or even the federal government can learn from what California's doing?
Well, one of the biggest takeaways for me is that housing, it's not just a local issue.
Right.
It's a regional thing, a national thing even. We need to be thinking bigger and working together more. For too long, we've kind of left each city and town to deal with this on their own. And California's law is saying, hey, state and federal governments, you need to step up, especially when those local zoning rules have just made things worse.
It's like realizing that a leaky roof, it's not just a problem for one room, it affects the whole house.
Exactly. You need a solution that fixes the whole thing.
Right, a comprehensive approach.
And this ties into another important lesson. You have to find that balance between the urgency of building more housing and the concerns of people who already live there.
Right.
California's trying to do that with this mix of incentives for developers and requirements for affordability and getting the community involved.
Right.
But as we've seen, it's a tough balance to find.
It is. It is. It reminds me of that saying, be careful what you wish for, because change, even when it's for the best, it can be hard.
It can.
But even beyond the policy itself, what's driving this need for affordable housing? Why is this such a big deal right now?
Well, there are a lot of things happening all at once. More people moving to cities, bigger gap between the rich and poor, and not enough new homes being built.
Yeah, it's like all these forces are pushing together to make housing less affordable.
They are, especially for people who are already struggling.
Right.
And, housing, it's not just about having a roof over your head.
Right.
It's about people's lives, their health, their opportunities, their sense of community.
It's foundational.
It is. And if that foundation is shaky, everything else suffers.
I like that. Solid foundation, everything else can be built on top of that.
Exactly. And that's what makes California's experiment so important. It's not just about numbers, it's about fairness. It's about making sure everyone has a decent place to live.
That's a powerful idea and a really important one. But we've seen that there are a lot of challenges, a lot of tough decisions. So as we move forward, what are some of the big questions we need to be thinking about as a society?
Well, one of the big ones is, how do we make sure that everyone benefits from all this new housing? Not just the people who can afford to live in those new units.
Right.
California's law is trying to do that with those affordability requirements, but we don't know yet if it'll work in the long run.
So it's not just about building more, it's about building the right kind of housing and making sure everyone can access it.
Right. And we also have to think about how to build communities that are diverse and inclusive.
Yeah.
We don't want to end up with neighborhoods that are segregated by income.
Right. We want a tapestry, not a patchwork quilt.
Exactly. And we can't forget about the environment. We need to build in a way that's sustainable. You
Yeah.
know, energy efficient buildings, more walking and biking, less driving, and making sure we have green spaces.
So it's about building smarter, not just bigger.
Exactly. And I think what California is showing us is that there's no magic bullet. What works in one place might not work in another.
Right.
We need to be flexible and try different things and learn from our mistakes.
So it's about being creative, experimenting, working together to find solutions.
That's it. And what gives me hope is that more and more people are paying attention to this issue and demanding action.
Yeah, it's not just a problem for politicians and experts to solve anymore.
Right. We all need to be involved in shaping the future of housing because it's really about shaping the kind of world we want to live in.
That's a great way to put it. Well, folks, it looks like we've reached the end of our deep dive into California's housing revolution.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've talked about the law, the challenges, the opportunities, and hopefully we've given you a lot to think about. This is just the beginning of a much bigger story, and we all have a role to play in writing the next chapter.
We do.
So keep asking questions, keep pushing for change, and keep the conversation going. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Thanks for having me.
And until next time, keep diving deep.